Hello, my name is Alex Iles, and in today's episode I'm going to ask, what type of border was Hadrian's Wall? Welcome back. In the modern age, borders and who is allowed to cross various borders is a very, very complicated and difficult topic. We're going to be talking today about one of the most famous borders of the Roman Empire, Hadrian's Wall. And we're going to be discussing what type of border was it. Was it a hard border that people weren't allowed to cross? Was it a soft border where people were allowed to move quite freely? Was it a militarized border? Was it an economic frontier? Or did it have another purpose entirely? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and go through those points today and talk to you about them. Obviously, I recognise right from the beginning that this is going to be quite a complicated subject matter. The world today is a very complex place, and in this video I'm not intending to cause anyone to feel any upset, to cause any form of offence whatsoever, and so when you come down to the comment section, please keep that in mind as I'm discussing the Roman Empire from the 1st to the 5th century AD and its influence on the British Isles and also on the rest of the world. So it's not intended to cause any offence, but please put down in the comment section if you've got any opinions, because I'd love to discuss them with you. And now is as good a time as any, but to plug, if you haven't already done so, please subscribe, because I think you'll enjoy the content I produce here. So why don't we jump right into it and discuss what is Hadrian's Wall. So Hadrian's Wall is a frontier of the empire. The Roman Empire had stretched out across Britain, and the Romans had invaded Britain in 43 AD. From there, from various military and political interactions with the Britons, they had then expanded their empire to the point where they were up into the northeast of Scotland. Due to overstretching, conflict across in Eastern Europe, in modern-day Romania, and alongside that, the fact that they didn't find minerals in Scotland that would allow them to establish strong urban colonies, they pulled back into southern Scotland and then into eventually what is today northern England. After the death of Emperor Trajan, Emperor Hadrian became emperor, and there was a military crisis in Britain where the governor Quintus Pompeius Falco had to put down a rebellion, and coins were issued showing his victory over the Britons. From that, the Emperor Hadrian decided to build a structure across northern Britain. In today's miles, it's 74 miles from coast to coast, and it basically cut the island in half for the first time. There's an archaeologist called Nick Hodgson who comes up with different theories as to the build schedule of Hadrian's Wall. This stretches from a theory of it was started in AD 120 and finished in AD 123. That was started at AD 120 and finished in AD 124 with a war in Britain in the middle. And then the last one, it was started in AD 122 and finished in AD 126, which is the late theory, and that the war in Britain was at the completion of the wall. I personally agree with him and think that the middle option from AD 20 to 124 with a war in the middle is the most likely for the construction of Hadrian's Wall. The wall itself was originally planned to be 2 meters 80 centimeters wide, 3 Roman meters, and to be anywhere between 4 to 6 meters high depending on the landscape. Every 1 Roman mile there would be a mile castle, and these mile castles would probably have a garrison between 10 to 20 soldiers, with the largest ones possibly having up to a half century, up to 50 soldiers stationed within them, but more likely around about 40. Then, every 1/3 of a Roman mile, there would be a turret, which would provide vision for the garrison in those turrets, so that there would be a constant watch across Hadrian's Wall. Initially, when Hadrian started it, only the eastern side of the wall was built in stone, and the western side was turf and palisade construction, possibly lending itself more to the landscape of the western end of Hadrian's Wall. Though after Hadrian's death and the occupation of the Antonine Wall, and then after the death of Antonius Pius and the reoccupation of Hadrian's Wall, the wall was then fully refurbished and rebuilt in stone. So the wall from coast to coast, from the Irish Sea right away across to the North Sea, was a stone-built wall. There were also a number of forts built into the wall, but I'll cover that later on in the talk as well. Troops were brought in across the entire empire. These troops were brought in mainly because the Romans were quite militaristic and clever in their own way. And what they did is they never allowed troops to be deployed in the same country they were recruited from. They were taken from their home nations and then they were brought over to the British Isles, and in the same way Britons were sent over to Germany, to Romania and to other parts of the empire as well. So you can see that there was always that movement of peoples which enabled for those troops to be loyal to the Roman army. One, because they were the occupying force and the natives would see them as Romans. And two, because of the fact that if you're taken to another country and you're relying on the army to look after you, that's quite a scary situation. And so you'll be more loyal to your officers if you're in that way of, if you're in that scenario, and therefore you're more likely to follow orders and then follow the Roman way of things and Romanize over time, or to become more Roman. So that's an interesting one in itself. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to jump into the different types of border Hadrian's Wall could have been, and we'll discuss the various aspects of it as we go through. So we'll start off by discussing, was Hadrian's Wall a hard border? So, hard borders, what are they? A hard border is a border which doesn't allow immigration in, but also provides a barrier to anyone entering that particular part of a country. So when you've got a hard border, was Hadrian's Wall a hard border? Did it say no to anyone coming through? Well, the size and the design of it could possibly suggest that. The original design was for a wall 2 meters 80 wide, 4 meters to 6 meters high, stretching from coast to coast, and basically cutting the British Isles in half for the first time. There's suggestions that Hadrian, because of the rebellion against Falco, was very, very angry and basically just wanted to ensure that the British Isles that he considered economically viable was kept under Roman control. And so building a wall would have been one way of doing it. The native Britons did have the capacity to build in stone. You just have to go up into southern Scotland to see the amazing brochs that exist up there, which are giant towers, almost like a roundhouse on steroids, that exist in the Scottish landscape, which were possibly a direct response in some ways, with the constructions of the ones we see, to the Roman occupation in northern England. The difference between the native Britons and the Romans, though, was that the Romans were a militarised and also industrialised society. They could call upon resources across the entire empire, in many cases, being the case with Hadrian's Wall, being manpower. It's thought that half of 2 legions ended up building the wall, so roughly about 4,500 soldiers were stationed up there to construct the wall over a 3 to 4 year period. When they were constructing the wall, this would suddenly mean that now there was this hard frontier that would basically stop anyone from coming in and out of the empire. And in its early iteration, with the original plan to be 280 centimeters wide, there would have been a mile castle, as I've already mentioned, every 1 Roman mile, and a turret following on after that every 1/3 of a Roman mile to provide view. So this meant that the whole wall would have had maybe between 800 to 2,000 soldiers, depending on if you go for a low or a high estimate, stationed along the whole wall. Now when you're looking at that sort of garrison, it doesn't seem very much, but often the Romans worked on a defense in-depth system. So the wall would basically slow down any attackers, and then following on from that, the Roman army would be able to gather whichever forces it needed, be it auxiliary forces from the forts to the south of the wall, or legionary forces from York or Derva, which is modern-day Chester down on the Welsh border, and to bring them right the way up to basically then be able to fight against any incursion from north of the wall. When you've got that sort of border, the mile castles therefore would have enabled troops to go through the wall, but not to allow anyone into the actual wall itself and into the Roman Empire, so therefore providing a hard border which would therefore say, no, we're not allowing you through. There was also the ditch in front of the wall, which would have been 2 to 3 meters deep at various locations and around 6 meters wide, with the soil piled up both in front and behind, creating a 2 meter high berm, which therefore would have slowed any attacker. Then behind that again, you would also have the vallum, which was a set of double ditches in the same manner. Again, 6 meters wide, 2 to 3 meters deep, with 2 meter high berms on either side. So if you wanted to assault Hadrian's Wall, there would be quite a lot of effort to get through the wall itself. So this is why some people see it as a hard border, a way of looking north to the northern tribes, the Britons who live north of the wall, and basically keeping an eye out and saying, no, you're not coming any closer. And that's why, possibly in popular media, people say it was to keep out the Scots and the Picts. Though, to be honest, the Scots weren't even there at this point. They were still in Northern Ireland, in Ulster, and they wouldn't migrate into the west coast of Scotland until probably the late 300s, early 400s AD. And then from there, over the course of a few hundred years, would eventually conquer the whole of modern-day Scotland and create what is today known as the area of Scotland itself, through various interactions with the Kingdom of England and what would eventually come together over the medieval period. So that's an interesting one as well. So please take note, BBC, stop saying that Hadrian's Wall is the English-Scottish border, because it's not. It's the border of the Roman Empire, and England continues for quite a few miles before you even get to Scotland. So that's a bit of a pet peeve for me personally. So that's the argument for a hard border. We'll go on to a soft border now, and we'll continue from there. A soft border argument would look at Hadrian's Wall and say, well, how can only 800 to 1,000 troops be able to provide a military defence? No, the wall itself was actually designed instead to control the movement of people north and south. The Romans themselves were all about political control as well as military control. They wanted to be able to control those tribes and extort them for taxation, and not only just in the fact of monetary coin value. There's a really interesting argument that could be made that would show that the Romans were actually trying to get the native British hooked onto pottery and Roman goods. We find that in the settlements north of Hadrian's Wall that there are often things like Samian ware, Roman pottery, and amphoras that end up amongst native British hands. Often when they were considered old, or alongside that as well, damaged by the Romans. So maybe they were selling on their second-hand goods, or giving brand new products to certain tribal leaders to go, this is what you could have if you stay on the side of Rome. Maybe they were sending up amphoras of wine or things like that to try and sort of show that the Roman Empire was something beneficial to the native chiefs. And the native chiefs who want to be close to Rome would therefore get the benefits of maybe tax breaks and other things like that would enable them to trade more with the Roman Empire, therefore keeping peace because of the fact that people didn't want to lose access to their newfangled international markets and other things like that. It's a brilliant way of putting economic control over a foreign people and therefore being able to control a huge amount of area with less military troops. And so when you're looking at Hadrian's Wall as well, you've got to think that, as I said initially, you're looking at 800 to maybe 2,000 soldiers on the wall in its initial design phase of how Hadrian initially envisaged it. So with that maybe would have been a better way of doing it, to get the natives hooked on local goods and therefore have a soft border, which would have encouraged trade, interaction, and eventually allowed the Romans to incorporate the northern British into the Roman Empire through trade rather than having to militarily conquer them. And we also see that as well happening in southern Scotland as well, when Hadrian's Wall was abandoned with the construction of the Antonine Wall and the moving of Roman goods into what is today southern and central Scotland. So there was definitely influence no matter what throughout the whole period, and it was about projecting political power into the foreign tribes, into Rome's enemies north of the wall. Now let's look at the next option, a vanity project. Was Hadrian's Wall a vanity project? Do you think that Emperor Hadrian may have fancied himself a bit of an architect? Well, actually, there's plenty of sources when we look at it that suggest he did. Wherever he went in his empire, he always tried to build public structures, and he fancied himself as an architect. There's one story as well where he built a temple, and another architect was assisting him. Now, the Romans literally believed that the temples were houses of a god, and that the statues within them could be taken over and possessed by the god themselves, and then the god could, if they wanted to, walk out the temple and interact with mortals. And when they designed this temple, I believe it was one for Zeus, if I'm correct. I can't remember off the top of my head. But the architect pointed out that if the god stood up, he would bang his head on the ceiling. And I believe that Hadrian forced him to commit suicide after that. Hadrian wasn't too pleased with the feedback he'd received from that meeting. So in the same way, some people argue that Hadrian's Wall was a vanity project. To build a wall from one side of an island to another to cut it in half was one thing that basically hadn't really been done before. Ancient monuments obviously had been built around the world, but to build a wall from one coast to the other, to cut an island in half, would say a lot about the military exploits of Hadrian and what he was able to do. And therefore he would be able to publicize this throughout the rest of the empire. The fact that he had used the legions in Britain to build this, the fact that it was holding out and provided a strong border and frontier for the empire, and it was a good PR campaign that Hadrian would be able to send back and say, look, and every single emperor until me, the empire has expanded. This has cost us high taxation, this has cost us difficulty, this has cost us loss of men in wars, and it's also meant that we have got constant issues with rebellions. And you can see that within recent history with, my adopted father Trajan and his wars. Look at all of that. What I'm doing is I'm creating stability, and by building this wall, I'm protecting all of you from the dangers of the barbarian outside our frontiers. So in many ways, it could have been a political statement, a vanity project mixed with that would show how great Hadrian was. And I find it quite funny because up here in the northeast of England, there are many businesses and also structures. For instance, our only skyscraper in Newcastle is named Hadrian's Tower because it's built just off Hadrian's Wall on Westgate Road. And so that massive structure there, Hadrian himself would have gobbled that up. He would have loved the fact that a huge skyscraper was named after him. The only thing that probably would upset him is that maybe it wasn't half as big as some other skyscrapers in other places in the world. He very much like an emperor, and we have to think of these emperors. We talk about good emperors or the reigns of the good emperors and things like that. But many of them were basically just tyrants. They were dictators of their period with total control over the empire in so many different ways, from military to economy to the huge amount of land and wealth that they controlled within the empire. And so we mustn't overly romanticize these individuals, because a lot of the time we would today describe them as dictators and not really be enamored with them as individuals as well. Let's talk about the military possibility for Hadrian's Wall. I mentioned already that the wall, when it was first planned, was going to be 2 meters 80 centimeters wide. But then, after Newcastle, it drops down to 2 meters 20 centimeters wide. And the reason for this is possibly because when the Romans were building Hadrian's Wall, the Britons revolted. And when they revolted, suddenly this huge monument was at risk. And when it was at risk, the Romans had to go to war. And we know that a lot of Roman forces in Britain were actually mauled, and Hadrian had to send across reinforcements to actually help to build up the Roman forces in Britain again and win this war against the natives. So that's why, as I mentioned earlier, when we're looking at Nick Hodgson's possible theories of when the wall was built, I believe it was started in AD 120 and was finished in AD 124 with a war in the middle. And then after that war, Hadrian decided that he needed to fortify Hadrian's Wall. And so when he needed to fortify Hadrian's Wall, he added 17 forts into the wall. Now, when he added 17 forts into Hadrian's Wall, this transformed Hadrian's Wall as well, because Hadrian's Wall went from being just a barrier in the landscape to being a full-on military frontier. You're looking at possibly the garrison going from, as I said before, 800 to maybe 2,000 soldiers to being anywhere between 9 to 11,000 soldiers, plus the soldiers behind the wall, and they built 3 forts north of the wall as well. So all in total, we could be looking at anywhere between 10 and maybe about 14,000 soldiers, depending on how you count it, the frontier being. That's a huge garrison of troops along the frontier. And when you have that as well, you've got to think of the recruitment, the deployment, the moving of soldiers around the empire, the fact that soldiers were drawn from as far away as Romania, Dalmatia in Croatia, Switzerland. Eventually later on, we know that there was at least one unit that was possibly raised by Marcus Aurelius or Septimius Severus of Moors from North Africa, and Syrian archers also stationed near the centre of the wall as well. So people were drawn from all over the empire and sent here to fortify this frontier of Roman Britain. So that just shows you how important it was to the Romans, and as a military frontier, it was providing a huge amount of support to the Romans in defending the British Isles. Now, one of the things that is often said is, well, was it to keep out the fearsome Scots? And as I mentioned before, obviously the Scots weren't there. But let's just replace that with the Picts or the Northern British. Was it designed as that? Well, we know whenever the Romans fought the native British in pitched battles, they won, because the Roman army was designed for pitched battles. To use an example which is sort of tragic from recent history, when the NATO forces went and fought against the forces of the Taliban in Afghanistan, initially the victory against the Taliban was very, very quick. And when it was very, very quick, it then settled down into guerrilla warfare. And so over the course of that, NATO forces lost a huge number of troops, but alongside that as well, the native people of Afghanistan, the people of Afghanistan themselves, also saw a large death toll as well. Because what would happen is the insurgents could obviously look the same as farmers. And when they looked the same as farmers, they could just, watch the NATO forces, ambush them with IEDs, explosive devices, and alongside that as well, they could also basically set up ambushes and cause huge damage to NATO forces at great cost to NATO. So when this happened, you can see possible similarities to how the Romans were having to fight in northern Britain. Because what would happen is, let's say a patrol goes out from Hadrian's Wall. They walk along, they meet a farmer at his farmstead, he chats to them, they sell him some second-hand pottery or something like that, and in turn, he pays them in sheep or cattle or grain, and then they take it back. They go out again in 2 weeks' time, everything's fine. They go out in 3 weeks' time, everything's fine. They go out in 5 weeks' time, bam, they get hit by an ambush. Suddenly, they've let their guard down, they're used to it, and suddenly they get hit by an ambush, and let's say they lose half their patrol. And then suddenly, you've got this going on. It's basically low-level warfare, guerrilla warfare. And so that's the theory of what was happening here in Britain, that the Britons were expert guerrilla fighters. And so because of that, you need a large amount of troops to be able to maintain that land so you can keep control over an enemy that's constantly shifting, constantly moving. And also, they might not be the guys within the first 100 miles of Hadrian's Wall. People could come from far further north and do guerrilla tactics against you and basically be raiding, but also the natives might also be participating in this as well. So it's a very complex scenario. And on top of this as well, there's the presumption that the people south of the wall were also your friends. Why would they be? You've just cut their island in half. These people who've lived there for thousands of years are suddenly cut in half and aren't able to access land where, let's say, their cousin or maybe their brother or sister were living north of the wall before you built a huge wall right the way through your land where your family were farming for centuries. Are you going to be happy about that? And so the vallum, the ditch behind the wall, is often considered to be a defence for the soldiers at Hadrian's Wall to protect them just as much from the people south of the wall as it was from the north. Because we often see that every 30 to 40 years there was a rebellion in Britain, and it might be that memory of fighting back against the Romans continued, and so low-level guerrilla warfare and rebellions were a constant problem within the British Isles, which is why there were so many soldiers, anywhere some estimates go between 60 to 75,000 soldiers actually stationed within the British Isles during the Roman period, because of the fact that this island was constantly rebelling and participating in low-level guerrilla warfare against the Romans as well. So there's another interesting factor, that the wall probably definitely at different points provided a military function as well. And we can see that from the fact that pretty much it was refurbished under Septimius Severus, under Theodorus, and alongside that as well as we think under Flavius Sitico as well. So all of these different people were involved in the repair work that wouldn't be needed, because if you build a wall and you expect it to stand for 300 years without repair, it's very unlikely. You constantly need to do repointing, repairs, parts of the wall are going to collapse due to heavy rain or warm summers or things like that. And so you need to constantly keep on top of it to make sure that it is managed and in good shape as a military frontier against the Romans as well. Another interesting factor as well is that an academic called Richard Madwick from the University of Cardiff has actually been doing analysis on the isotopes from cattle and sheep and pigs found along Hadrian's Wall and in the British Isles. And what he actually found was that a lot of the cattle, sheep and pigs on Hadrian's Wall were brought down from the Highlands of Scotland and from northern Scotland. And so these animals have been brought down to Hadrian's Wall as a form of taxation. So it's a really interesting one as well to think that the tribes and the people north of the wall were actually supplying the food that kept the military occupation against them going. And so if you're thinking about that, maybe there's that very complex relationship where the soldiers are reliant on food of north of the wall, the people north of the wall are not happy about this and then would maybe rebel against them and cut off the food supply, which would then possibly cause for the Romans to have to go north, do a military campaign to basically then reinstitute the food supply to keep the soldiers in Britain, to keep the island under control. You've got this wonderful chicken and egg problem of what's going on in Roman Britain in this period. So I love that one as well. We'll now discuss the fact that the Hadrian's Wall itself was not actually the end of the Roman Empire. So what do I mean by the fact that Hadrian's Wall was not the end of the Roman Empire? Well, if you think about it, the Roman Empire actually continued for quite some distance, because I talked about earlier the fact that the Romans, when I was talking about the soft power heading, would project political power into the tribes north of the wall. And when they projected that power into the tribes north of the wall, this would be done in hoards of silver and gold that are found in Roman Iron Age Scotland. So these, and in also Northumberland as well. And these tribes were being paid large amounts of gold, large amounts of silver, and they were basically being kept on side in return for, as I mentioned before, the food that was being imported from north of Hadrian's Wall in the form of grain, in the form of cattle, in the form of sheep, in the form of pigs, to actually keep the wall going. So you had a weird symbiotic relationship between both sides. And alongside this as well, in the late Roman period, in the 4th and 5th centuries, we see a lot of inscriptions written in Latin, or at least sort of vulgar Latin, dedicated to Christian individuals who have Latinized names. So there's this suggestion that in the late Roman period, what's going on is that actually the wall is no longer the frontier. And that is also being backed up by some people suggesting that the walls, garrisons and the forts aren't as well defended and aren't as well repaired as they had been in earlier periods. That actually the frontier had been pushed further north, and that is then also backed up by the finds of huge amounts of Roman silverware found in places like Trapain Law, just outside of Edinburgh. And this amazing hill fort actually has a late Roman occupation phase with a huge settlement that possibly survives from the 4th century right the way through into the early 6th century, where people are living up there with Roman supplies, housing influenced by the Roman Empire, and it could also be a tribal capital that is being propped up by the Romans as a buffer state or actually an actual part of the empire north of Hadrian's Wall. So we need to do more research about that, but there's a good theory that suggests that that's possibly what's going on up there. And so when that's going on up there, that could suggest that actually Hadrian's Wall at some point stopped being the end of the Roman Empire, and the Roman political power had stretched much further than that. And we see the same on the Rhine and the Danube frontiers, where there are settlements that are influenced by the Romans, and even Roman villas north of the Danube as well, which show that connection between the Roman way of life and the native peoples who live north and to the east of the Roman Empire as well. These people no longer saw themselves as of their tribal identities, but even though the Romans could be considered enemies at different points, they were also the Romans' trade partners, and they were also interconnected with the Roman Empire itself. So even though you might support an attack on the Roman Empire, you also would be selling them their goods as well. And the Roman Empire's supply of amber was coming down through the area of what is today Romania and Bulgaria, and going in through the Danube frontier into the Roman Empire there as well, coming from as far away as the Baltic. So it's amazing to see that those interconnected areas where we think of the wild barbarians beyond the frontiers were so interconnected with the Roman economy, and the Romans were in some ways reliant on them for certain goods as well. So it wasn't just a case of the wild barbarian versus the Roman. These frontiers were a lot more complex than people allow. So in conclusion, what type of frontier was the Roman Empire? I would say, unfortunately, we can't come down and say, yes, it's definitely this, this or this. It's actually yes to all of the above. At different points, the Roman Empire would have maintained a hard frontier with Hadrian's Wall. But at the same time, it was also a vanity project that Hadrian could use politically for his own gain. It was alongside that time as well a soft boundary, so the trade was going north and south as well. The military was also a huge part of the influence of the way that Hadrian's Wall worked. with anywhere between 9 to 13,000 soldiers possibly stationed in and around Hadrian's Wall, influencing the local tribes, relying on them for food and supplies, but also supplying them in turn with Roman goods and changing the way that Roman Britain worked. And then with the adoption of Christianity, spreading this new religion further north than the wall itself and influencing the populations who lived there. So all in all, the frontier wasn't just as simple as saying that it was a hard frontier and we have to build this wall against the barbarian, and it wasn't as simple as the idea of open borders as well. The Romans used the wall as they needed to use it, and its function changed over time, and its interactions with the people north of the wall changed depending on whether or not they were friendly, hostile, reliant, dependent, or no longer dependent and self-sufficient against the Romans. And that shaped the way that the British Isles worked as a frontier of the Roman Empire and as a way of this province was interacting with the Romans too. So I really enjoy that, and I really hope that as well you've learned something and maybe got another insight into Hadrian's Wall, because so often you can just see it as one thing, whereas in fact at different points geographically along the wall, at different points in its history, at different points in the wars that occurred throughout Roman Britain, the wall had a very different function, very different meaning, and very different symbolism to the people who were living north, south, and on it as well throughout the whole time. You can just imagine at certain points the people on the wall would have been seen as saviours to the people on the wall and south of the wall, but at other times they'd be seen as oppressors, and they could also be seen as an occupying force by both the people north and south of the wall as well. And also, if you're a trader and you're living in one of the settlements outside the fort and you feel as if the soldiers are taking advantage of you, then you're not going to have a positive opinion of them too. You've also got to think about the families who are living around there as well, such as the women and children. They would have had both positive and negative influences from the army because of the way that it would influence them, their families, their lives, and also how much time they would get to see with their loved ones, the soldiers who actually lived within the fort. So I really hope that you've had a really fun time looking at this history of Hadrian's Wall and a debate about what type of frontier it was. Because so often today in our world we look at frontiers and they cause us to have political division or unity or all sorts of things like that. And the debates of where countries' lines should be and shouldn't be is obviously very apparent within the British Isles as it is in other places in Europe as well. So I hope opening up this debate about the Roman Empire and saying, look, Hadrian's Wall itself was very interesting and very diverse in its own way, will help us to think about our modern times and about the way we look at borders and frontiers in our own world today as well. As always, please do like and subscribe, share the video with your friends, and if you would like to support me further, I do also have a Ko-fi account and a Patreon account down in the description as well. That just means that I can set aside time to do these videos for you and basically just create this amazing content that I hope that you enjoy too. In the meantime, stay safe and well, and I hope you'll join me for another episode in the near future. Until then, have a lovely rest of your day.